Alright, let's get the boring stuff out of the way first. I'm just kidding, it's gonna be fun. Hello everyone, Mouse98 here with a new video. Today's topic is cognitive psychology. Why that topic specifically? Well, because, as I have mentioned before, I want to be a psychologist, and the type of school of thought I want to get into is Cognitivism. So today the video will be broken into three parts. The first one will be the definition and history of Cognitivism. I cannot speak. The second part will go over the key components of it, and the last parts will of course be my thoughts. Now, let us begin. First, let us know the definition of cognitivism before we look into its history. Check.com states that cognitivism is a form of study within the psychology field that focuses on the mental processes along with how people will perceive, think, remember, learn, solve problems, and direct their attention to one stimulus rather than another one. Now, cognitivism is contrasted with behaviorism. By the way, I did do a video on behaviorism, link will be in the description. Where behaviorists only concentrate their studies on observable behavior. Yes, this field of study contrasts with behaviorism. As I have stated in my Behaviorist video, behaviorism is considered by some to be a reactionary form of psychology. Now, what is the historical background of cognitivism? Well, the earliest form of cognitive psychology came from the Greek philosopher Plato. He is noted to be the first person whom had presented a coherent theory of how knowledge is acquired and even retained. He had stated that the ideas are created in the mind and that we project them in our world. Plato had concluded that the outside world is an illusion made up of these projections, and reality lies within inside us, thus saying that we can learn by looking inwards. Other early forms of it, such as the theory of conceptual theory of mind, can be traced back to philosophers such as Descartes, and even recent, as of the 1940s, by Alan Turing. Now, the term cognitive psychology had been coined in 1967 by a man named Ulrich Neisser. Neisser had published a book that had provided a definition of cognitive psychology, stating that it was a dynamic information processing systems whose mental view emphasized by its point of view. Now, it is important to know that cognitive psychology is actually still quite recent. The psychological research only really, start gaining its discipline since the 1950s or late 50s and in the early 60s. The whole cognitive revolution was started by the well-known anarchist Noam Chomsky in 1959 of his critique on Skinner's behaviorism. Looks like Noam Chomsky wasn't that bad as I thought. He stated, the way of concerning mental processes has pervaded psychology more generally over the past decades, and you'll most likely find these theories within social psychology, personality psychology, abnormal psychology, and even developmental psychology. Now, before we move on, I have a fun fact I just found out relating to this. Due to computational metaphors and terminology, cognitive psychology managed to benefit with when the research of artificial intelligence during the 1960s and 1970s. Kind of cool, but then again, AI doesn't really interest me that much. Now, what are the key components of cognitive psychology? Well, 1. Human behavior is something that can be explained by a scientific process. 2. Our behavior is explained through the series of external stimuli. And 3. Behavior is controlled by our thought process, which is opposed to genetic factors. Now, it should be noted that cognitivists don't outright reject everything of behaviorism. There is a practice called cognitive behavioral therapy. It's just that it goes beyond stimuli in the sense that it takes the thought process into consideration. However, cognitivism has its cons. One of the major cons that I have an issue with is that it does not take genetic factors into account. Whilst yes, things such as sociobiology is used by reactionaries, it being used here can be of great help, as it combines genes and heredity with social issues. It can also be used for a more left-wing sense. Some argue that cognitivism itself is reductionist. As cognitivism does take case studies into account, it is argued that behavior approach attempts to apply the scientific process to that of human behavior, tries to paint it with a broad brush, I'm assuming that's what it's trying to say, which is unique to each individual. In case, I would argue that we can take into account of each individual, but as a statistic, there has to be some form of criteria in order to understand it. So, what are my personal thoughts of cognitivism? Overall positive. I'd say it is better than behaviorism and can be used together, such as how Leninism is used with Marxism and how Maoism is used with Marxism-Leninism, in that kind of sense. Now, can it be useful for the left? I think so. I mean, it can be useful in general, but the idea of examining human thought through the processes of thought and stimuli can be useful in understanding human psychology. We can even apply it with historical and scientific materialism, as our surroundings also influence our thought pattern along with our external stimuli. It is something I will further investigate, and I suggest you do too. Anyway, that was my short video on cognitivism, about 6 minutes long. So feel free to like, dislike, comment, and subscribe. As for my next video, I think I'll go over abstract expressionism first before I go over this so-called cultural Marxism. Ugh. Anyway, thanks for watching. Mouse98 signing off.